Poetry is one of the first other types of text that is introduced to children at a young age over fiction and nonfiction. Of course, those are the first two types of books that children are exposed to. In the second grade, which is what I teach, we have used poetry 3 or 4 times throughout the year. We have wrote different types of poems. The most popular one that we work with are acrostic poems. Those are the most simple types of poems to start children out with when teaching poetry. I know in first grade that they have done 1 or 2 acrostic poems as well. We often read other types of poems, but as well as having children create other types of poems, we don't really expose them to that yet until about the third grade. But we do read a lot of narratives or concrete or ballads, haikus. We have read each one of those. My students personally enjoy acrostics and the concrete poems over the rest of them, typically because the concrete poems, they enjoy the different shapes of the poem and how the shape of the poem goes with what the poem is actually about. They really enjoy that. From a teaching perspective, I would have to say that poetry provides children with more enjoyment for the text. Poetry tends to be more fun for early children. As you get older, poetry can start being more emotional and sad and more depth and meaning. But for children at the elementary age, poetry is normally something that is fun for them. It helps them identify their feelings, how things can make them feel. That is something that hasn't really been asked, is how does this book make you feel, until poetry. That is when it is really, how do these words make you feel, as well as with working with rhyme and repetition and with other sound patterns. Children really enjoy working with the rhyming sound patterns. I also think that poetry helps children create their own visuals of imagery and not just looking at the book the whole time to figure out what's going on or to help them with comprehension problems. As they're reading poetry, it has a lot of descriptive vocabulary in it, so they can kind of imagine what's going on in their own mind because of all of the details of the words that are given to them in poetry, which is something that I, as a reading recovery teacher, have worked with, is to help them with their comprehension as we read, and I'll use poems a lot for this. They have to draw or come up with what's going on in their head as I'm reading one sentence, one sentence, one sentence. And then we'll talk about the whole stanza and what image that stanza created. Another thing that poetry does for children, I believe it helps them be able to express themselves more. Being exposed to that type of vocabulary helps them be able to express how they feel as well, not only just from the words in the book. Children can discover the power of words, is I guess the best way that I would put that. They can acknowledge how much power words do have. They can make you feel a different way. The elements of poetry that teachers need to cover are rhyme, rhythm, repetition, shape, and imagery, of course, which is what I just talked about. These things are all things that need to be talked about when teaching poetry, as well as, the different elements, I guess you could say, of poetry. To where, as in normal writing, you would refer to them as sentences and paragraphs, and to where in Poetry, they are verses and stanzas, which is something that needs to be addressed when teaching poetry. They need to know that it is different, as well as covering mood and rhyme and rhythm and all of those other things that we have already spoken about. Ways to teach children to enjoy poetry is, like I said, pretty simple at this age because it is meant for enjoyment. As you get into high school, it can be a little bit more challenging. I had struggles in high school trying to really understand poetry because of the such different vocabulary that is in poetry. You really have to think about what is going on. One of the poems that always stuck with me that I had to do set like a close reading in for high school would be The Raven. That poem has always really stuck with me. It has a lot of mood changings in it. It has different vocabulary. It is very, very descriptive, which is something that I enjoy. Um, Last, I would just have to say that poetry is a very valuable element for teaching children. It helps them understand things in the world, share their feelings and experience, and help them with imagery and visions. It helps provide enjoyment. Um, it's just a really useful thing for teachers to use, and I enjoy teaching my students poetry.